A good Erev Shabbos. As we get older, some of the parts start to wear out. You may have noticed. One of the things that people notice gets more difficult is that they become hard of hearing. What's that you say? It's a real medical phenomenon. Nowadays we have all kinds of supports, help for that. There's another phenomenon which is not necessarily related to aging or physiology, which is that some people become hard of listening. This can occur at any stage or any age of life. It's not that they can't hear, but rather they have trouble listening. At the end of some movie, the name of which escapes me, the last scene is of a wife who's a bit of a yenta, real busybody. She's chattering away while her husband sits on the couch reading his newspaper, and as she natters on, the last thing you see is the husband reaching down and turning down the volume of his hearing aid. It's one of those old-fashioned ones with the big microphone hanging from the neck. He just turns down the volume and tunes her right out. So we see that he's become hard of hearing, but he's willfully making himself hard of listening. He just tunes out. We're all at some stage of aging, and perhaps some of us are even becoming hard of hearing. But hard of listening is something we can work on and cultivate and resist. Perhaps even if our hearing declines over the years, our listening can improve. The Gottman Institute is a resource on the psychology of relationships, interpersonal relationships, how to cultivate them and nurture them and preserve them, which someone recently wrote, you'll need to do if you've been married for longer than a week. Communication is an essential, maybe it's the essential building block of a relationship, any relationship, and it needs attention and refinement to be a help and not a hindrance. Why is that? Because when we think of communication, we think, is my message getting across? Are my words being heard? That's right, but it's only part of the story, of course, only half the deal. We also have to listen. We have to receive and process and internalize the information that we're receiving. A short essay on the Gottman Institute website at the University of Washington in Seattle talks about these elements in listening, these several elements. To approach with curiosity. That means listening, not just to get on with it as a chore or a duty we have to suffer through, but rather assuming that we might actually learn something valuable about the other person or about the information they're trying to convey, if we listen carefully enough. There's also a fascinating element they called tuning into your inner silence. Fascinating because the idea resonates in so many places with Jewish thought, where it says a person has to make space in their hearts or minds for new knowledge. If you think you know everything already, it's very difficult to learn something new. The way they express it is a full vessel cannot hold anything new, while an empty vessel is able to hold new material. You have to sort of empty yourself out a bit, make a little space, allow for an inner silence to be in order to listen to new things. And the tough one is to listen to understand rather than listen to respond. If you pay attention to this, how often in most communications are we listening, and while we're listening, we're already formulating our response. We're making up our reply to what the other person is saying, rather than actually listening in order to understand. That is a toughie. And the last point they mentioned is to cultivate heart-centeredness, they call it, meaning to listen with care and compassion rather than judgment. We all run the risk of being less able to hear as we move in life. However, this gives us a lot of hope and optimism because we can all work on becoming better at listening. Our portion for the week this week, Naso, is famously the longest single parsha of the Torah. There are a lot of elements in it, and it's a source of wonderment. What exactly what one has to do with the other. We have at the beginning the drafting of Shevet Levi, the tribe of Levi, into service in the Mishkan, which will later become the more permanent temple. There's the laws of purity of the community, the camp, the Israelite camp. There's a mention of laws of theft in there as a basic element of any society. The instruction about what to do when marital infidelity is suspected, followed by the laws of the Nazarite. The priestly blessing is spelled out, which we just did last week on Yom Tif, and then the installation of offerings that the head of each tribe brought when the sanctuary was dedicated. This is also our reading for Hanukkah. The last element in this lengthy parsha is the very last verse, verse 89 of chapter 7 of the book of Numbers, God speaking to Moshe. It says there, when Moshe arrived at the tent of meeting to speak with God, he heard God's voice speaking to him from atop the cover that was on the Ark of Testimony, from between the two cherubs, the Keruvim. He spoke to him. Let's understand that passage according to Rashi. When Moshe would come into the tent of meeting so that God could communicate with him, Moshe would hear Hashem's voice as loud as he heard it on Mount Sinai. That's why it says the voice, HaKol. It's not just any voice, it's HaKol, the voice, God's voice from Sinai. However, the sound stopped at the entrance to the tent. So if someone were standing right outside, they would not be able to hear it. Even Aaron, Moshe's brother, could not hear it if he was outside the tent. Rashi's quoting the Sifra, collection of Midrash, as a source for what this miracle entailed. It says that earlier in Exodus, Rashi explained to us, that the divine voice in Sinai also had a boundary in time. There was a horn, a shofar, that was sounded at the end of the revelation at Sinai, which signaled the end to this chapter of God speaking to us, and the departure of the Shekhinah from among us and its return on high. This is a source, by the way, for us blowing the shofar at the end of Ne'ilah, at the end of Yom Kippur. We've been so close to God all Yom Kippur, felt the divine presence. Now, the Shekhinah is on the elevator, going up. So there, the closeness of God's presence is limited in time. In our parsha this week, in the tent of meeting, it's limited in space. Outside the entrance to the tent, it's not audible, even though just inside, Moshe hears God's voice as if he were standing at Sinai. Fascinating. Let's take that idea of hearing versus listening and try it out here. Have you ever been in the airport waiting for a flight and they have those news programs going on every TV monitor, everywhere you go, everywhere you try to sit? You can't find a place to sit and read quietly or think or catch your breath without the news blaring away at you around the clock. We tend to shut down our listening when that happens. We don't hear anything. And even though the sound is everywhere, so it makes it pretty distracting, we need quiet. When you're in a place of tranquility and your ear is poised, that's when you hear the birds chirping. That's when you hear a faraway crunch of leaves in the woods or the rush of the river. We need silence to be able to listen properly. Maybe this is why God's voice stopped at the entrance to the tent. What would it be like if we heard God's voice talking to us all the time wherever we go? Maybe it would take away our free choice. Don't eat that, not kosher. Don't drink that, it's fattening. Don't buy that, you have two at home already. It would get pretty nudgy pretty fast, wouldn't it? Like the henpecked husband in the movie, we would just keep turning down the volume until we didn't hear anything. The way it works, we have to keep our ears open, listening for the divine. So let's revisit those points from Dr. Gottman and see how they might apply. First was to listen not as a chore, but to assume that we might actually be open to learning something. There's sometimes a naturally occurring filter when we're tuned into the Jewish channel. We assume that we've heard it all before and we're just in for more of the same. The joke is that a couple were on their way out of the shul and they stopped to say Good Yom Tov or Good Shabbos to the rabbi, Good Yom Tov, to the rabbi. In a momentary lapse of judgment, the rabbi asked them, what did you think of the sermon? They said, well, Rabbi, to be honest with you, every time we hear you speak, it's always the same old thing. You're always saying Kol Nidre, Kol Nidre, Kol Nidre. But the fact is, some people tune it out as soon as the parsha begins, the sermon begins. As soon as the davening begins, they tune it out. Because they've heard it all before. If we look at it not as a chore, but a chance, a moment in which we can find out something new, maybe about the davening, maybe the portion, maybe we'll find out something new about ourselves, it's a game changer. The middle point was to listen to the silence. There's a lot of noise in our world, an awful lot of noise. The noise in the airport or the muzak in a mall or the elevator, wherever you go. It's like somehow there's a conspiracy to make sure that we never experience silence. With our phones beeping all the time, alerts, this, that, we're even bringing it on ourselves. If you Google up Silent Retreats, Ontario, you may come across Sugar Ridge Retreats in Wybridge, where for a tidy sum of $2,000 a week, you can have a retreat into silence. It's a bargain. There's probably some that cost much more. But the idea behind this luxury retreat is to get away from the noise, retreat into silence. Another time we'll talk about getting away from light pollution. When you get far, far out of the city and it's truly dark at night, that's where you can really see the stars. Unfortunately, in the city, it's difficult. And the same with noise. You have to be in a place of silence to really have a hope of being able to hear. And the last of Dr. Gottman's points to us was listen with care and compassion rather than judgment. This is another way the net and our phones and our hyper-connected life in the digital age have rewired our minds. We listen and we judge. Is this worth listening to? Am I wasting my time? Is this worth the effort? What's their angle? Is this a scam? Is someone trying to take advantage of me here? How am I going to answer when their speech is over? When they're done talking, what do I have to say? We have so many filters and safeguards up. It's very hard to put that aside and really, truly listen with an open mind and an open heart. It pretty much goes the same whether we're trying to listen to someone else or trying to listen to God or even trying to listen to ourselves. Maybe this passage in our weekly portion is encouraging us and giving us the strength to dial up our care and compassion and listen more fully with more openness. The name of the parsha is Naso, to lift up, to raise up. That's what we're doing when we're more attuned, when we become better listeners, and when we can learn from silence as much as words. We lift ourselves up. We elevate ourselves, our souls, and our senses to Chaye Achayim, the real essence of life, to be connected, to be attuned to holiness, and always to see potential ahead of us for good things. Shabbat Shalom.